I would now like to invite to the stage Georgie Dickins, trusted advisor and C-suite coach from the Cajetan Group, Vivienne Artz OBE from the UK International Data Transfers Expert Council, and Corinna Mitchell, Symphony General Counsel.
What? Oh, we're meant to sit under our names.
Oh, okay. This fireside chat will be focused on how to navigate, lead, and innovate in today's ever-changing environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've got 30 minutes to do, well, as deep dive as we can into, yes, how to navigate, lead, and innovate in the changing world. And as Brad, when he spoke initially, you know, the last 2 years have been incredibly challenging. You know, we're living in a world where there's volatility, ambiguity. We're living in a really complex world where change, the level of change we're experiencing is unprecedented. It's pervasive, it's exponential, and it's acute. And it requires a different style of leadership. And coupled with that, we've got political pressures, economic, you know, technology is advancing faster than ever before. And in talking to many of the clients I work with, the fintech players and some of the big banks, one of the core themes that's coming up when I speak to them is, how do I navigate the change? How do I navigate this changing landscape? And I want to bold and underline and highlight the word how, because there is no playbook. There is no secret recipe here. We are definitely learning as we go. And the word that they use to describe this period that we find ourselves in is heightened disruption, because it is heightened. And managing change and getting ahead of it has always been a core part of leadership. It's always been a core part of leadership. Change is inevitable, but it is the pace that we're experiencing. And I think it's also we're juggling so many balls with competing priorities. So this begs the question, how do we innovate? How do we maximize profit? How do we create growth in the circumstances we find ourselves in? And to help us answer the question, I'm with Vivienne and Corinna. And Corinna, I made a note when Brad described you as the pitfall avoider and the business accelerator, because I'm like, I want you on my bench. And look, it's our intention today, we've only got 30 minutes, so it's our intention to keep it high vibe and to share with you our thinking and to offer some insight, golden nuggets, wisdom based on what we're experiencing, and hopefully to catalyze your thinking further. So Corinna, I'm going to start with yourself, and I suppose it would be really good just to set the stage for where we're at now and how you've seen things shift and change over the last 2 years.
Well, it's been enormous change. Just taking a very personal example, when I joined Symphony, all my interviews were video interviews, and that was a massive change for me. And then I worked remote, and then we have moved into a hybrid working environment now, post-COVID, and that is really huge. I've also seen just the amount of change, the way that we communicate, the way that we interact with each other, that different communities use different communication channels. So, for example, with the rise of cryptocurrencies, it's its own financial community. People in the crypto world communicate using Discord and Telegram. It's all very disparate. So the old world of you're at your desk, you have the telephone, and you have your email, and that's it. It's completely different now, and there's just so many different ways. It can be really hard to keep up. And then, of course, with regulation, which I touched on earlier, that is also becoming much more complicated and taking into account how we use technology and really altering what we do on a day-to-day basis as well. So that's just some of my personal observations that I've seen. A lot of change, a lot of almost distribution of communication and the way that we work.
Okay, so you know we're talking here about we've got new ways of communicating, new ways of interacting, and we've got the old world, and it's how can we leverage the lessons that we've learned? From the last. I always knew sitting on a stool was going to be difficult. How can we leverage the lessons that we've learned from the last 2 years, to optimize them for the future?
I think it's a really good question, and just having a look at the world in which we're living, we need to acknowledge that we're in a moment of utter transition. We're moving from an industrialized economy into a digital economy, And that's no longer the future, that is very much the present. And I loved what you were saying a little bit earlier, Corinna, about regulation and how that is evolving. And what that says to me is that we're having this bleeding effect between what is and what isn't a market, between what is and what isn't your workspace, between how we manage and lead and how we conduct our private lives. And I think we need to be thinking very clearly about the opportunities of where we are, but we'll be able to navigate better if we stop and think about where we are right now. Where we're going to, we can have a vision for, but we also need to understand where we are now. And I would suggest there's 3 things that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about data. Data is the cookie crumbs. That is the trail that is going to lead us to where we want to go. And we've acquired an enormous amount of information and data over this very, very turbulent time. And the other piece is digitization. We take that for granted in the financial services sector. We've been savvy. We've been digitizing and datafying for years. We're very, very good at it. Yes, we accelerated enormously during the pandemic, but actually this has been second nature for us since who knows how long. And the third thing is humanization. What we have seen throughout the pandemic is the humanizing element. Suddenly, it is now people first. We forgot about our people. We were focused on revenue returns. We were focused on business achievements. We were focused on innovation, but without that context of the human. And I think that humanification of our learning is really, really important. And it was one of the banks actually that had the approach to the pandemic of people first. And that led all of their behaviors and the actions that they took accordingly, and it resonated very, very well indeed. And I think it's one of the things we need to think about quite carefully as well, is that with this data, with this digitization, which will exponentially lead to innovation, we need to remember that the output needs to have a positive human impact. Otherwise, we're not going to be taking anyone else on this journey with us, and actually we may even miss the point altogether.
Yeah, if I could build there on the humanness piece, because that's certainly, in the work I do, a shift I've seen over the last 2 years, about being more emotionally intelligent, having empathy, having understanding. It's shifting. We need to listen more. We need to hear. We can say we listen to our clients, our investors, our people, but are we truly hearing them? And I think now, when I look at people moving companies, moving roles, a big component that certainly features into their decision making is, what does the leadership model look like? Do they care? Are their values, words on a wall, or are those values actually lived and breathed? Do those values translate into behaviors? So I think that's a really key piece about the humanness, because it's, if I have this people-centric approach, it builds trust. And with trust comes loyalty, comes commitment. And so I think that's definitely a shift that I've observed. And the other piece that I've certainly noticed with leaders is the importance of being transparent. Transparency is equity. And, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, leaders didn't have all the answers, and everyone's looking to leaders for confidence, for certainty, for clarity, for conviction. And sometimes you don't have the answers, but it's about still giving them information that you do have available to you, because I think transparency, without that, that's where all the sidebar conversations happen. It causes confusion. So with transparency comes clarity, and I feel that really feeds into rapport, it feeds into trust, which feeds into culture. So that's, the humanist piece really resonated there. Corinna, what are you thinking, hearing us talk about the human element there?
Well, I fully agree that the human element is so important. It's what makes our day-to-day lives better. And I was just also really focusing on your point about transparency, and thinking that when you're in a volatile situation, no one knows all the answers, exactly as you said, Georgie, and you only know everything when it's all over. That's when you've got all the data and you know everything. So being upfront and sharing with people is something that makes a big difference, and leading without saying that you know all the answers, and then tying that into regulators trying to increase transparency, information sharing. And actually there's quite a lot of debate in the market about some of the transparency measures that regulators have asked us to implement in our industries. But that's definitely the sort of the trend on the regulatory front as well. So it's sort of a big theme there.
But I would suggest that the transparency is getting more difficult to achieve, particularly in relation to the data space, because one of the things that we are seeing is greater efforts towards data sovereignty and greater efforts toward data localization, a ring fencing of data, an attempt to ring fence innovation, to protect roles. We're seeing a huge amount of this taking place in lots and lots of jurisdictions across the world. And with that comes an increasing suspicion of data. So the transparency piece is so fundamentally important, and data can be used to give transparency. But what we're also seeing, certainly from a regulatory perspective, is a huge amount of restrictions on the flows of data. And that is pretty counterproductive. In fact, I brought my glasses because I can't see anything without them. And so I just got to get the data point right. But the GDP impact of cross-border data flows surpassed that of global goods trade, not last year, not the year before, but in 2014. I mean, this is old data. Isn't that fascinating that cross-border data flows, the GDP impact is actually greater than that of global goods trade, and has been for so very, very long. And yet now we're seeing a backlash and a reaction in relation to data. And yet we're all here because we understand the importance of cross-border data flows, of sharing of information, access to critical information, for leaders to have access to information they can better understand both their clients as well as their people. And so they can be better leaders. They can be leaders that are learn-it-alls rather than know-it-alls. Yeah. And I think that's a big transition that we've made throughout this pandemic, is that very often leaders previously were leaders because they knew it all and they led from the front. And we found that empathy, kindness, listening, that learn-it-all mentality, that growth mindset, learning from our experiences and our mistakes to go further, to do better, is resonating incredibly well, not just with our employees, but also with our clients. But to do that, we also need the information, and we need to pick up all those little cookie crumbs of data that we've learned over the last 2 years, what we've learned about people, about organizations, about how we work best, and what isn't working.
Yeah, and the word that popped for me when you were speaking there about growth mindset is around openness. You know, are we being curious? Are we looking at past trends, historical trends? What questions are we asking ourselves about the future, which comes to reflect, you know, how are we thinking about what world order looks like in 10 years, the economy? There is something there, you know, it's very easy to be in this constant throughput task execution, but how much time are we, you know, spending to be like, you know, where are we at now? What are the lessons? What are the learnings? What could we have done differently? How can we use the past to inform the future? And also, how can we be thinking ahead to think, you know, so we can meet those opportunities head on when they come? So the word that really came for me is openness. You know, are we being curious? Are we surrounding ourselves with an echo chamber, homogeneous voices? Or are we seeking out different ways of thinking? Are we seeking out that the cognitive diversity, you know, as we're seeking out new opinions?
And are we interconnected?
Yes.
Because our world is so hugely interconnected, and we're seeing this from the regulatory perspective as well. Regulatory overlap, yes. Overlap between data and competition, overlap between data and financial services. It's the regulations and the previous historical silos of how we worked are bleeding into each other, and what we're seeing is that interconnectedness is very much the way forward.
Yes, and it is interesting what you're picking up about the urge or the focus of regulators, which is their markets, their geographies, versus business, people, information, capital, which wants to flow and be cross-border to be the most efficient. And that is a real tension that I don't think is going to be resolved in the near future, because regulations are like this, And the rest of the way we like to do business is like that. So I guess as humans, we can best bridge the gap ourselves by building that connectedness and being open. And of course, that's the way we at Symphony like to try and develop our products, is to be open, to promote interconnectedness, and not to be this kind of closed box. You have to come here, you have to work this way, but to try and go to how and where people want to work and provide that interconnectedness for them. So that's what a lot of our products today are focusing on as well.
Although what's interesting is actually I'm seeing the regulators are changing their mindsets. So the consultations out at the moment, particularly in the UK, you've got the Data Regulators Cooperation Forum, and you're looking at how different regulators are regulating. Look at what the FCA is coming out with in terms of the focus on culture and diversity and inclusion, recognizing the importance of culture within a firm. It isn't just about tick box compliance. It's actually, do you have the right behaviors? Do you have the right culture out there? And recognizing that they also need to collaborate with other regulators because they are no longer in those silos. And of course, during the pandemic, they've had to change how they regulate because people couldn't be at trading desks.
Yeah.
You know, they had to be able to regulate in a different way. So I think there's a real opportunity to move forward with regulators as well as with business in order to navigate a much better future for ourselves.
And so what's coming for me there is, you know, as a leader in today's environment, there's a lot of voices to be listening to. You know, we've got regulators, investors, clients, you know, just to name a few. So how do you suggest, you know, you go about seeking input? You know, how do you suggest, you know, whose voices should you be listening to?
Well, I'd say you should listen to everyone, but then sometimes you listen to no one. But it is particularly about seeking out different voices, looking at younger people, people from different cultures and with different perspectives. And I really think it's very important to have that sort of to bring forward people with their different perspectives and encourage them to actually voice their views. You may not adopt it, but unless you hear it and listen and encourage it, it's very hard to get that diversity of opinion.
I think the diversity is hugely important, and not to forget generational diversity within the workplace. We are seeing a significant change in the way in which people are working, the length of time that they're working, taking work breaks as well is becoming a real feature. And of course, we're seeing the pressure not just from our clients and our investors and our employees, but also from the regulators to encourage businesses to have a much more inclusive approach to the way in which they do business. It's not just about doing your Voice of the Employee survey once every 12 months and getting a nice little data point and then moving on from there. It actually has to be much more dynamic. And I think we found during the pandemic, those leaders who checked in regularly, those leaders who didn't use a tick box approach to engagement were the ones that actually had much more engagement with their workforce, with their people. It was interesting to see the characteristics and traits that were very successful during that very challenging period of time. And some of the behaviors which we've often associated with leadership, they didn't work so well. So, you know, there is definitely that flexibility that we need, but we also need to be thinking about if we are looking at the data that we've gathered around what the experience was, what people are actually looking for, and how we can innovate, we need to use that data carefully as well to make sure that we come up with the right vision and head in the right direction.
Yeah, because I've seen examples of where companies have got the employee engagement survey very, very right, and where it's translated into them rolling out new ways of working, and they've demonstrated they're listening, they're hearing, they're integrating what they're learning from the data that they're receiving. And I've learned those where it is checkbox. And for my mind, people want to feel seen, they want to feel heard, they want to feel that their voice matters. And it's not that you can give employees everything they want, but again, it's showing that you listen, showing that you care. And I think that's such an investment in the relationship, the rapport, the culture, the trust. And that's where I've seen cultures become more cohesive, become more collaborative, where there's open communication, there's trust. And going back, the word listening again, they feel listened to. I just want to circle back, I'm conscious of time, where you were talking about data, and that kind of led me to think about clients. Like, how can we get ahead of their needs? Because we can be reactive, and then it's, you know, given the world we find ourselves in, how can we get ahead of their needs? What can we be thinking about?
Well, it's asking questions. I always think it's best to go, and when you're talking to customers and clients, ask questions rather than always telling. Now, of course, we're here demonstrating products, but they are the result of a lot of questions that our customer relations people have been asking all of you. So that's number one, is you can't listen unless you ask the questions and you have that inquiring mind. So that for me is the first and foremost.
I think the other thing is actually to take a survey of what are the opportunities out there. I agree with your approach. It needs to be an opening, listening approach, as opposed to, guess what, I came up with a really good idea. You're going to love this. I hope you do, because it's not one that's going to work any longer. It's more about, you know, what are your issues? What are your challenges? How can we help you to solve those? Yeah. That has to be the approach. Open questions are great, but sometimes people don't know what they're missing. If you probe a little bit deeper and say what's difficult, what's going really well, what's sticky, what is the bit that's missing, then we can work together to actually overcome that hurdle together, and we can do so in a much more interconnected way. Because I think that's what's really key, is that things aren't dealt with and addressed in silos any longer. We need to be thinking about how we can leverage off other learnings, how we can leverage off other systems, other processes, other relationships in order to meet that end.
Yeah, it's when you were speaking, Corinna, I watched Ted Lasso, which I loved, and there's this clip where he's like, be curious. And I love that clip because it's like, be curious, ask questions. It gives you data points. And it's not purely about being curious. It's, again, going back to and listening, really listening, which then gives you insight. It gives you knowledge. It gives you, so I think the listening piece is, are you listening to understand? Or are you listening to reload? But, you know, Corinna, when you were talking about with your clients, like, are you listening because it's a tick box, I'm asking a question? Or do I care? Am I genuinely interested in what you have to say? And then, Vivienne, it links to your interconnectedness, because this is about collaboration, this is about partnership, this is about working together to find solutions.
Very much so.
Okay, so one of the pieces here, we've touched on like adaptability, and I think, you know, as we talked about, change is pervasive, it's exponential. When we think about adaptability, what does that mean to you? And I haven't, Corinna.
I think it's always be learning, basically. So always learn, and then you can adapt once you learn. And the other thing is, as you get a few years on, you can get to the stage where you think, yes, I've got lots of experience, I know how to do this. But actually having that humbleness to think, I can always do it a different way. I can always listen to other people's ideas. And you know, for me, changing industries, which I have relatively recently in my work life, it is about just embrace it, enjoy the change, ask questions, see it as a way of learning and doing new things. And for me, that's the essence of adaptability.
I think often we're afraid to adapt because it's change, and when change happens to you, it's very disconcerting, and it can be what's often thought to be an unhelpful experience. But when you're the author of change, it can be very enabling and powerful. And I think we need to think about adaptability as having one foot in something you know and one foot in something you're willing to explore, so you don't feel that you're at sea, but you are bringing skills, experience, expertise, insights, even your imagination to the new activity where you don't necessarily know what the answer is going to be. And I think if you can ground yourself with one foot in what you know and then put your other foot in the new experience, in your adaptability brain, I think that's how you can be much more successful.
Yeah, when I think of change, I think change is messy in the middle. You know, it's lovely if it's all rainbows and unicorns, but it's not. So change for me is messy in the middle, and there's an element of embracing it. And speaking to both your points about curiosity, you know, when I look at extraordinary leaders, they're voracious learners. And they have the humility to share what they don't know, and they seek and solicit from those that are experts, that have wisdom and expertise and knowledge in different domains. And to the point, I think, I can't remember, Brad, what the title was about fog for the, and we don't have all the answers. We can't, there's no crystal ball to look at, what the world looks like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but we can look what A to B looks like. And then once we're A to B, then what are we predicting B to C? And I think sometimes we have the long-term goal, and it's great to have the long-term goal, but it can be overwhelming when we are in the midst of fog. So I'm always like, let's break it down, let's chunk it down. What can we do now? Let's keep momentum, let's keep moving. What does A to B look like? Because then it gives us more insight and knowledge about how we can take that next step.
Well, when you're in the fog, you need a compass.
Yes.
And I think it's that cultural compass that can lead you through. So if you know what your values are, you know who you are, and you know how you want to behave, I think that can help navigate that incredibly difficult bit where, frankly, you can't see what the future is at all.
There's one interesting thing actually about change. Studies have shown that people who are going through difficult times tend to cope better with those changes and difficult times if they have a sense of agency, if they can feel that they're in control of some part or have an influence on some part of it. So I think that's also a little bit echoing what you were saying, Vivienne, about making sure that you have some input, if you can, into the change and placing yourself as a little bit of a part of the change in a positive way, and people tend to cope better with it when they do that. And of course, we at Symphony like to help put humans in control of the changing processes. That's part of our mission. But it just sort of sparked that memory in me that when people deal with trauma, if they have some agency or they feel they had some agency, they can cope with it a lot better. Not all change is traumatic, of course.
And to build on that, agency, I think it's as well, control what you can control. We can't influence laws of gravity, we can't influence microbes, we can't, influence many things. We can influence how we show up, we can influence, we can control our mindset, our behavior, our attitudes. And just pulling on, I think, just bringing to conclusion some of the core themes that we've discussed today about how do you navigate through this ever-changing, complex, ambiguous world that we find ourselves in. And I suppose the three things that are coming for me is one of them is about that adaptability. It's about adaptive leadership. It's about situational leadership. Leadership, it's constant, it's evolving. Every day requires you to tap into different toolkit, different skills, flexing and every day and growing, being curious. I think the second piece was about openness. And I mean, these could all interconnected, but openness, open to learning, open to growing, open to seeking input, open to looking through different lenses and getting different perspectives. And I think, with openness, with adaptability, it's also then about building in that thinking space. And I remember one of the clients I worked with a few years ago, he said, look, I make time to daydream. And when he said that, I was like, wow, that sounds quite childish. But it's childlike, because children think about things, they explore, they allow their thoughts and mind to wander, to think about how they could do things differently. So I think that third piece underneath the adaptability and openness is make time for thinking, because that's then going to inform how you show up. That's going to inform the decisions you make and the choices you make as well. Is there anything you'd like to add to conclude our session?
I just want to say one thing, which is we often hear the piece about getting back to normal. And I think if there's one thing that really irritates me about the experience of the pandemic is I wish we wouldn't use that term going back.
Yes.
The future is going to be different, and I think we need to be looking at it through a different set of lenses. So whether we're pulling on our existing skills, our experiences, our learnings, the information, the data points that we've gathered, we need to be thinking about it as forward-looking, not going back, because there is nothing to go back to. The world has changed fundamentally. People have changed, the mindset has changed, the expectations have changed. So leveraging the learning points which you've articulated will help us to continue to move forward positively.
Yes. Thank you everyone for your time, and I think we're inviting Alexander back to the stage.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Georgie, Vivienne, and Corinna, for an insightful conversation. It's a great start to the day. It is now time for a short 30-minute break, so please enjoy some coffee, tea, and refreshments in the back of the room. Swing by the demo booth up there on the left. And we will rendezvous here at 3 o'clock, so we'll see you soon.